speaker tonight. Rochelle Johnson is a leading scholar of Susan Fenimore Cooper, and with her co-editor has made Cooper's environmental writings available to today's readers. The current president of the Thoreau Society and a past president of the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, her work has been supported by grants from several organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities. She is professor of American Literature and Environmental Humanities and director of the honors program at the College of Idaho, which is the state where she is speaking to us from tonight. And her lecture tonight is from a book in progress. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass things off to Rochelle. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A, and we ask that any questions that you have, please place them into the chat, and I will act as your friendly moderator when that time comes. But Rochelle, thank you so much for joining us again, and I cannot wait to hear what you're going to say about Susan and the Hudson River School tonight.
Well, it's just great to be here, Kevin. I wish I were there in the Cooper Gallery like last time, but I'm delighted to be coming at you from Boise, Idaho, and just thrilled to see so many of you here today on the list of attendees. It's grand fun to scroll that list and see some of your chats. I want to start by offering some thanks to several people there in Cooperstown. First of all, to Joe Festa in the archives at the Fenimore Art Museum Research Library. Joe has been unstintingly generous to me for many years, providing materials from the archive, and just want to give a little shout out to him and big thanks. Also to Richard Walker, a photographer in the Cooperstown area. Richard Walker took many of the photographs of landscape paintings that I'll be sharing with you from the Fenimore Art Museum's collections. I'll be sharing a lot of paintings from a lot of collections, but Richard Walker really deserves our thanks for such fine photography of many of the materials there at Fenimore. And then to Kevin, our host today, whom you've all just seen and met and got a taste of how delightful he is, manager of arts education at the Fenimore Art Museum, and just doing such good work there. I'm delighted to be here in anticipation of Earth Day, and my remarks are really going to focus on that upcoming important day in the history of our nation and in our future too. So I am going to share my screen here, which is always a trick of the trade. It just takes a minute. And we're going to do this, and then I'm going to pop up a little red pen so that I can do a bit of laser pointing during the remarks that I'm about to make. Okay, I need a minute. Slow communication. Okay, great. Hopefully that is working for all of you. My remarks today are going to focus on Susan Fenimore Cooper and Thomas Cole, and I'll say a bit about them in just a second, but I want to start by explaining my title, Making Beauty in the Broken Places, Susan Fenimore Cooper and the Hudson River School. Susan Fenimore Cooper was quite connected to the painters of the Hudson River School, and I'll explain a bit of how, but it interests me very much that both Susan Fenimore Cooper and Hudson River School painters were interested in representing landscapes that were undergoing profound change. So that's hence my reference to broken places. That'll become clearer as we go. This is Thomas Cole, who's widely understood to be the founder of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting. Cole was a European man who emigrated to the United States as a young man and returned to Europe to study more art history and to practice art, but then did come back to the US and produced some of his most celebrated artwork here in this country. Let's see if I can get rid of that. Yes, I can. Okay, great. The other person I'll discuss is, of course, Susan Fenimore Cooper. And Susan Fenimore Cooper was from Cooperstown, lived there most of her life, but she too was a writer and a naturalist and a philanthropist and someone also very interested in the landscape of the nation. I am unable to advance my slides, which is very strange. Let's see here. There we go. I think there might be just a big delay because there are so many of us on the call. So just bear with me here. But there's Susan Fenimore Cooper, much of our subject. Oftentimes, when we hear the words Thomas Cole and Cooper, we turn immediately to James Fenimore Cooper and his relationship to Thomas Cole. And that's important to acknowledge in a discussion of Susan Fenimore Cooper and Thomas Cole. So as James Fenimore Cooper's second daughter, his eldest to survive to adulthood, Susan Cooper grew up very much in James Fenimore Cooper's circles, aware of the people he was spending time with. And Cooper and Cole were friends. They spent time together in New York City, especially. They crossed paths a bit in their time in Europe. And Cole did some incredible work to acknowledge James Fenimore Cooper's writings by creating a whole series of paintings that depicted fictional scenes from James Fenimore Cooper's novels. So that's one that I'm showing you here from the collections at the Fenimore. Thomas Cole's landscape scene from The Last of the Mohicans. Cooper wrote the novel, Cole made the painting, and together they were really practicing a celebration of the young nation of the United States of America and of its attempts at cultural production. We tend to forget how young the nation was in the early parts of the 1800s, but this was a fabulous coming together of literary effort and painterly effort to begin to tell stories of the new nation. I'm not going to dwell on James Fenimore Cooper and Cole. The Fenimore has a fabulous little program on that online that you can watch yourself, so I encourage you to look at that if you'd like to. But instead, as I talk about Thomas Cole and Susan Fenimore Cooper, I want to explore two stories that emerge from their work. One of those stories is likely quite familiar to us. It's tied to the iconography and picturesque aesthetic of the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting, and I'll unpack those things for us in just a few minutes. But the other story that I'm learning to see in the work of Thomas Cole and in the work of Susan Fenimore Cooper is probably lesser known to us, especially when we think about the artistic productions from this period. It's the work of contemporary writers, people who are writing now, today, who are teaching me, their works are teaching me to see this alternative story in some of these 19th century cultural productions. They have me thinking about the environmental changes of the past and how those changes of the past shape who we are today. The period I'm focusing on today is often called the American Renaissance, and that's a period that spans 1836-ish to 1855-ish, 1836 to 1855. And we call the period the American Renaissance because there truly was an outpouring of artistic production in this time period. Now that reflects the fact that artists and writers were highly conscious of the nation as a new nation and of their role in kind of staking a claim for the United States on the international scene in terms of artistry. They needed to distinguish the nation's artistry. They needed to celebrate its landscapes as they did so. They wanted to make a name for their young country. And so they saw themselves as real leaders in this regard. The American Renaissance was, of course, a time of really rapid landscape change. Tremendous development and clearing of land in the name of settlement, and eventually of growing industrialization. So this conscious artistic production often celebrated this development and this progress, as it was known then, this landscape change. I'm focused on this Cole from the Fenimore Art Museum collection, and I'm going to zoom us in just a little bit so that we can get a better look of it on our small computer screens. But I want to focus on this as a fairly typical painting in the paintings of the Hudson River School. So Cole influenced many decades of painters, and I'm going to show you some paintings by artists he influenced. But we'll also just focus on coal for a few minutes here to think about that traditional iconography that emerges from the Hudson River School of Landscape Painting. So the picturesque aesthetic that defines Hudson River School landscape painting has a few characteristics, and I'll spell them out while we're looking at this painting. There's often a balance between wild landscapes and domesticated ones. And that told a story to viewers of the paintings. It told the story of recent state of wilderness being developed, changed, adapted to make way for settlement. And that balance that's shown was intended to be quite comforting, reassuring. Even though there was so much wilderness remaining on the continent, those spots of settlement, and we see one literally cradled here in this painting, in the middle of the painting, those spots of settlement provided reassurance for safety and for domesticity and comfort. Also common in a Hudson River School landscape painting, and we see this here as well, are reminders of the recent wilderness condition of the land. So here we have a man standing by trees, some of which are fallen, some of which are growing. Clearly, we can't escape in this painting the recent wilderness condition of this place, in spite of the domesticated strip sort of in the middle of the painting. The picturesque aesthetic in Hudson River School landscape paintings typically also evoke the cycles of life. And I'll talk about what I mean by that for just a minute. The cycles of life were a loaded concept in the middle of the 19th century. We often think of the cycles of life as referring to youth and old age, to the fact that as the old die and pass away, the young are coming along, and we have a cycle of life that is both comforting and bittersweet. That cycle of life notion took on sort of a different life of its own in the founding decades of the United States of America, because people understood their new civilization to be replacing civilizations of the past, namely Native American civilizations. And so that really troubling dynamic that we identify now of Euro-American assumption of cultural greatness and cultural superiority and their right to come in and move away other peoples, that cycle of life is also somewhat captured in these paintings. Let's look a little more closely at this particular painting so that we can see some of this at play. What I've done here is I've zoomed in on that domestic scene, the village, and I'm going to use my pointer here. We have a village settlement here in Esperance, New York, not far from Cooperstown at all. And a bridge, a real indication, a sign or a symbol of structure and power and safety, of transportation, of movement, of control over the landscape. There are many roads also in this particular painting, and then outlying buildings, again reassuring us on over here, again reassuring us of the settled nature, the safe nature of this space. Of course, up here we've got some cleared agricultural land, so this is a thriving community, and again we're seeing this sort of harmony between the wild and the domesticated, but with lots of reassurance of safety on the domestic scene. Here I want to call attention to the trees that we see and also to the man. So very typically in Hudson River School landscape painting, there is a figure, a human figure, in addition to the human presences that we see through buildings and roads and agricultural land, sometimes animals, domesticated animals. We also see human beings. And the fact that this man, Caucasian man, Euro-American man, is resting very comfortably, taking a break perhaps from his work, indicates leisure. So that's another comforting and reassuring element of the paintings, that all is well. We can see the leisure in front of us. And then I'll point to the trees and the sky. So these trees are that indication of the cycles of life. We often see in Hudson River School paintings a dead tree or a dying tree or a felled tree right next to a thriving living tree. And that's a reminder of the cycles of life, both in terms of generations and civilizations, for better or for worse, troubling notion. And then look at the sky here. So we traditionally read the Hudson River School iconography as the brightening sky being again, the reassuring indication that all would be well. That sun is shining down on the valley, the settled valley, whereas the darkening skies are passing away. So anytime fraught with uncertainty will pass away as the new nation thrives. Well, in these paintings, the history of the recent dispossession of lands from Native Americans is generally silenced in favor of this endorsement of Euro-American settlement and the development of land. That harmony, that perceived harmony between the wild and the domesticated is important for us to bear in mind, as is that silencing of dispossession and violence towards Native American cultures. This is another Cole, perhaps his most famous. I've written about this painting and talked about it elsewhere, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a great example, again, of that canvas showing us the domesticated scene, lots of signals of thriving settlement, boats on the water, agricultural fields, vehicles moving through those fields, and then homes, cleared forest lands. So obviously thriving community. And then on the other side of the canvas, the receding storm, the receding wilderness even. Even in this painting by Cole, which is just a stunning magisterial view, I think, we get those reminders of the domestic. Even though the Hudson is so far away in this painting, there are very visible boats. I don't know if you can see them. I'll go around them with my pointer here. There's some of them. And then settlement along the river. So even in this large, seemingly overwhelming wilderness scene, there are those subtle reminders of domesticity. And again, that's intended, the traditional iconography says that's intended to make us feel comfortable and make us feel like all is well, even though we're on this precipice, this huge hill in front of us. And I'll call your attention again to those paired trees there, the dead dying tree, and then the one that's just doing fine to the right of it. This is the last painting I'll show you just to illustrate the traditional iconography, Ashby Durand's Progress, a very, very famous painting titled The Advance of Civilization Progress, so that if we had any question about what was up here in these paintings, we learned through Durand's title that indeed the paintings are endorsing this furthering of settlement and we know a silencing or an erasure of Native American dispossession. Part of what I hope to suggest is that the words and images in these paintings, the images in the paintings and the words I'm about to share with you, they have been seen to convey one story as they silence other stories. And I'm thinking that when we can identify multiple stories in artworks like these, we expose other ways of thinking, other practices, other concerns. We gain deeper insight into both history and the present. And I think that matters because stories shape us and they shape our landscapes. Further stories have consequences for how we see ourselves in the world. We often become the stories that we tell ourselves as we narrate our world, and our stories are encoded in the landscape. Art historian Angela Miller reminds us that this story of American progress is repeated again and again in the landscape painting of the 19th century, in the Hudson River School paintings especially, but by others as well. I'm going to turn us away from painting for just a few minutes and talk a little bit about Susan Fenimore Cooper. So I mentioned how Susan Fenimore Cooper was very knowledgeable about the picturesque aesthetic. She herself studied art quite closely. She studied art at the Louvre, both in terms of producing art and learning art history. She knew her artists, as we know from her writing, and she corresponded with some of them as well. But in her writing, she published this book, Rural Hours, by a lady. She published others as well. Her publication was anonymous here, but everyone knew who she was. In her writings, she shows us how well she knows the picturesque aesthetic by actually practicing it in her words. So I'm going to read a passage from her Rural Hours, and my hope is that you will actually hear some of the aesthetic that I have just been describing. This is a later painting, but one I just love from the Fenimore Art Museum. And it shows some people rowing, and I'm going to read to you from Rural Hours, a section in which Susan Fenimore Cooper is reflecting on rowing. So it seems fitting. Susan Cooper writes, on one summer day, recounting her view from Lake Otsego as she's in the boat. The hills and forests, the farms and groves encircle the beautiful sheet of water. Her language, as I'm about to read, her language captures the harmony of the scene. She writes, "Our own Highland Lake can lay no claim to grandeur. It has no broad expanse, and the mountains cannot boast of any great height. Yet there is a harmony in the different parts of the picture, which gives it much merit, and which must always excite a lively feeling of pleasure. The hills are a charming setting for the lake at their feet, neither so lofty as to belittle the sheet of water, nor so low as to be tame and commonplace. There is abundance of wood on their swelling ridges to give the charm of forest scenery, enough of tillage to add the varied interest of cultivation. The lake, with its clear, placid waters, lies gracefully beneath the mountains." Cooper's description lays emphasis to a sense of appropriate balance of scenic elements that were celebrated by the Hudson River School. The heights of the hills are proportional to the lake. The hillside features trees such that they're neither barren nor overcrowded. Just as proportion and balance are important to the painters of the Hudson River School, proportion and balance are the themes of Cooper's prose painting. There is a harmony, she says, in the different parts of the picture. The harmony in her passage continues as she goes on to contrast the human-made elements in her view with the natural elements. And I'll read again. "And then the village, with its buildings and gardens covering the level bank to the southward, is charmingly placed. The waters spreading before it, a ridge of hills rising on either side, this almost wholly wooded, that partly tilled, while beyond lies a background, varied by nearer and farther heights. The little town, though an important feature in the prospect, is not an obtrusive one, but quite in proportion with its surroundings." Cooper seems intent on proving that Cooperstown and its environs meet up to some pre-established criteria for landscape scenes. And in fact, that's just what she's doing. And of course, anyone who's been to Cooperstown know that Cooperstown is perfect aesthetically. So it meets all criteria. But in this passage, in all seriousness, we find her engaging in the American picturesque and thereby demonstrating the pervasiveness of that aesthetic, but also participating in its celebration of progress. What fascinates me, though, as we look more deeply into Rural Hours and read more widely in Susan Fenimore Cooper's work, is that other topics emerge that are clearly concerns about changes in the landscape. I'll talk a little bit more about this and give you a couple of examples. But she's very interested in fragility, the fragility of lands, in their degradation, in the regional extinction of mammals, in the apparently regional diminishing of numbers of birds, in deforestation, in the rate at which people are taking down trees. Here's something that she says about trees and forests, again from Rural Hours. "It is to be feared that few among the younger generation of trees now springing up will ever attain to the dignity of the old forest trees. Very large portions of these woods are already of a second growth and trees of the greatest size are becoming every year more rare. As a rule, the largest trees are singled out very early in the history of a settlement. In these times, the hewers of wood are an unsparing race. The first colonists looked upon a tree as an enemy, and to judge from appearances, one would think that something of the same spirit prevails among their descendants at the present hour. Here, and this is kind of a typical passage for Susan Fenimore Cooper, here we see her mourning, expressing grief about the rate of forest destruction, about the seemingly wanton way in which people are cutting down trees. She expresses different type of concern about invasive weeds, and what interests me here is her attention to such a small detail as plant life. But for Susan Cooper, the fact that old world weeds are taking over native species in the new world is quite concerning. She says, it's remarkable that these troublesome plants have come very generally from the old world. They do not belong here, but following the steps of the white man, they've crossed the ocean with him. A very large proportion of the most common weeds in our fields and gardens and about our buildings are strangers to the soil. The woods are no sooner felled to make ready for cultivation than they, she's referring to weeds, briars, and brambles, spring up in profusion. Here we see Susan Cooper understanding that there's a relationship between deforestation and trees coming down, and certainly the clearing of fields, and invasive species of plants. Again, her attentive eye is calling attention to some of the problems associated with progress or development as it's being depicted in the landscape paintings. Susan Fenimore Cooper also addresses the dispossession of Native Americans from their lands. She writes, and I have to say that the language she uses is horrifying to us today, and so we need to acknowledge that. She uses terms like red man and savage, Indian brave, terms that are really unacceptable to us today. In the language of her time, she says, when standing beside these unfettered springs in the shady wood, she's in the woods, she's near a spring, one seems naturally to remember the red man. We feel assured that by every fountain among these hills, the Indian brave must have knelt 10,000 times. It was but yesterday that such beings peopled the forest, beings with as much of life as runs within our own veins, who drank their daily draught from the springs we now call our own. Yesterday, they were here. Today, scarce a vestige of their existence can be pointed out among us. Well, Susan Fenimore Cooper was very aware that her settlement had displaced Oneida peoples and especially Mohawk peoples. Thomas Cole would have been very aware that the Hudson River Valley was home to Delaware and Mohicans who had been violently wrenched from their lands, displaced, dispossessed. And I'm aware today that I'm working and living on Shoshone-Bannock lands in the Snake River Plain of Southwest Idaho. That sense of dispossession, that awareness of Native American removal was very alive at the time. And yet we're not reading that when we're traditionally reading Hudson River School paintings. What fascinates me is that Susan Fenimore Cooper was not the only person who was expressing this sort of concern. Thomas Cole himself was concerned about changes in the landscape. In his essay on American scenery, which was delivered as a lecture in 1835 but published in 1836, Thomas Cole writes about some really iconic northeastern US landscapes. He writes about these places and celebrates their beauty in his essay on American scenery. And then at the end of the essay, his tone really changes. And this is just a couple of excerpts that I've pulled from the essay to give you a sense of his concern about the fragility of land in 1836. The wayside is becoming shadeless, and another generation will behold spots now rife with beauty, desecrated by what is called improvement. This is a regret rather than a complaint. Such is the road society has to travel. It may lead to refinement in the end, But the traveler who sees the place of rest close at hand dislikes the road that has so many unnecessary windings. The last part of that quotation is quite troubling, right? It's a regret rather than a complaint. There's still a sense here in Cole that the changes are inevitable, that they have to happen. Nonetheless, I want to call attention to his regret that they are happening. And here's just another passage from Essay on American Scenery. I cannot but express my sorrow that the beauty of such landscapes is quickly passing away. The ravages of the axe are daily increasing. The most noble scenes are made desolate, and oftentimes with a wantonness and barbarism scarcely credible in a civilized nation. So we have both Cooper and Cole calling attention to these points of fragility, to their concern about the changes in the environment. Well, I want to turn now to the work of Lorette Savoy, a woman who's writing today. She's a geologist at Mount Holyoke College. And call your attention, if you're unfamiliar with her amazing book, Trace, to it. Do read it. And then let you know how her ideas are shaping mine. So Trace is a book, as her subtitle says, about memory, history, race, and the American landscape. And Lorette Savoy investigates how memory and history are silenced in the American landscape, especially concerning the issue of race. And Lorette Savoy claims both African American and Native American ancestry. Well, I want to turn to some words of hers in particular that I've drawn from Trace and talk about how they're helping me rethink some of this 19th century material. Lorette Savoy writes, how a society remembers can't be separated from how it wants to be remembered or from what it wishes it was. That is, if we believe stories of ancestors reflect who we are and how we came to be. The past is remembered and told by desire. Silence has reinforced a status quo that continues to privilege what's always been privileged in popular history. What I'm interested here in this brilliant quotation is this juxtaposition of the desire to tell certain kinds of stories and the other stories that are silenced because of the privilege of the continued stories, of the repeated stories in popular history. And what I find so helpful is thinking about Cooper and Cole and their attention to the fragilities of the American landscape against that more dominant narrative of progress and development and an endorsement of dispossession of Native American lands, an endorsement of rampant landscape alteration and despoliation. So I want to walk quickly here through Thomas Cole's very famous Course of Empire series. I took this horrendous picture on my phone at the New York Historical Society, but I want to show it to you to give you a sense of the size of these paintings. If you haven't seen them, the 5 paintings are there to the left. The people at the bench are looking at them. These are rather massive canvases. And in them, Cole depicts what was understood to be this course of empire, this cycle of life in which certain civilizations take over other civilizations. And I'll walk you through each of these paintings just quickly to explore both stories at work in this series by Cole. So the Course of Empire starts with the savage state, and we see in this painting, pay attention always to this mountain and to the skies. They are a reflection of mood, as we saw in some of the earlier paintings. So in this savage, quote unquote, in this savage state, we see a dark world. Even the painting is dark. And there are figures who are sort of evocative of Native Americans, but also quite Romanesque in their appearance, and illustrating supposedly the savage state of existence, people living quite close to the land. And over here we have teepees and a fire, not a lot of infrastructure. The next The painting in Cole's series, Course of Empire, focuses on the pastoral or Arcadian state. And here, there's our mountain, but what we see are very clearing skies, much more light and greenery, and then signs of development and of settlement, especially at this pastoral state. Someone tending sheep, a woman out with her children, a child playing here, drawing in the sand, women frolicking and dancing, a boat signifying fishing, but probably also some leisure, and then a man here who's actually writing sort of mathematical figures if we look up close in the sand. Here is the consummation of empire, where there's just one big party. Our mountain has receded, so the natural world is not nearly as important in the consummation of empire. Skies are bright, and we have silk and lots of alcohol and partying and commerce and supposed success. But we know then what happens when a party is that ruckus. People leap to their deaths. There's fire, blood, statues beheaded, and our mountain is being overtaken on both sides by clouds moving in, indicating that this civilization is not going to last very long at all. And then the final painting is called Desolation. Here in Desolation, the sky is clearing, but it's almost like the end of the day, right? We've got dusk and lots of natural life intruding, as it were, over the former civilization. James Fenimore Cooper called this series a great epic poem. And we know that Cole was very influenced by Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was first published in the US in 1804. It was a well-known story, this decline of empires and rising of others. And it was a story that accompanied the young nation as it cleared lands of people in the name of growth and of progress. Yet there are silences here too. And that's what I want to focus on. The dispossession of Native Americans from their homelands is silenced, the broken treaties, the viciousness. Cole gives attention in subtle ways to some of the fragility of this environment, and to the very resilience of the natural world. And I'm interested in how he does this. At the New York Historical Society, where these beautiful paintings hang, there's some commentary about desolation, this last one. Their commentary reads, "This picture must be as the funeral knell of departed greatness. Desolation captures the exquisite stillness of a world without mankind." And this painting certainly does those things, but it also captures the exquisite richness and strength of biological life. Some images even convey movement amid that supposed stillness. This painting may be a death knell, but it's simultaneously a celebration of life. So I wish that we were all standing in front of this painting so we could see what I'm about to show you. But these are seriously zoomed in pictures of Cole's work, and you know how detailed it is if you've seen it in the flesh, so to speak. But we see the delicacy and fragility of individual plants in this painting called Desolation. We see birds flying through the sky. There's movement amid that stillness. We see birds, I think these are grebes, at least they look like they are to me, actively working in the water and in the grasses. A great blue heron fishing is also pictured in Desolation. And then a heron nesting. Now, if that's not a reminder of the cycle of life, I don't know what is, of new life, new natural life. So although the human presence is removed here, we're reminded of the resilience of the natural world. My favorite little detail in Desolation is this lizard. And in the iconography, I had to look this one up, but in the iconography, a lizard is a symbol of resilience, of absolute tenacity and holding on. So even though civilization has been decimated in this series, in this story, we've got all of these signs of life emerging. I just find that so hopeful. I want to return to Thomas Cole's view on the Schoharis just for a few minutes in order to suggest that those silences, those points of fragility are present even in these paintings that we have tended to read as an endorsement only of progress, as a celebration of American growth. What if we see not just that celebration here, but what if we see disrupted habitat? What if we see the broken riparian zone? And what if we think of that as a representative of all the birds, organisms, and life that would have been removed from this scene? What if we look at the sky and see not the inevitable coming of brightness as some sort of sanctification of development, but we see the coming darkening skies as a harbinger of forest fire, of climate chaos, of increased storms? What if we see this man not resting in a leisurely sense, only in a posture of reassurance, but what if we see him as grieving all of the destruction and change around him? All stories have their silences, and sometimes it's in these silences that we can find the greatest meaning. As we approach Earth Day, I know that in the words of Laurette Savoy, humanity's footprint already exceeds Earth's ecological limits. We also know, as Laurette Savoy also reminds us, that American prosperity and progress have come at great human costs. But just as Cole and Cooper were not living in the end times, neither are we. The Earth's landscapes, oceanscapes, and its species may be suffering, some even extincting, evanescing, vanishing. But there's much to save and much life that remains, ready for resilience. As we undertake the crucial work of examining who humanity might become in the face of climate chaos and growing environmental degradation, let's remember the power of the stories we tell ourselves. They can help us recall a greater fullness of who we have been. Here in the United States, I am not a citizen of a culture merely celebrating progress and development while silencing the environmental and human costs of that transformation. Cooper and Cole remind me that I am also a citizen of a nation in which artists and writers early recognized a landscape broken and breaking, and the peoples displaced and silenced in that process. I'm a citizen of a nation who possessed an artist and a writer who sought to capture the beauties and fragilities of this land, to voice and display their concern over its degradation, to call an alarm on behalf of the earth through their words and their images. Cooper and Cole's work on behalf of the environment was far from perfect. It was perhaps all too subtle, all too clearly influenced by blindness to the viciousness of systemic racism. It all too clearly adheres to an aesthetics that often endorses Native American dispossession and violent attempts at cultural erasure. My work is also far from perfect, undoubtedly participating in brutalities I cannot even see. Yet I can commit to trying to deepen the stories I tell myself and my students. I can encourage more complex stories so that we all might reclaim the complexity of who we've been. We can recognize the early concerns about development and landscape alteration, that long held, now centuries old environmental grief among us. And we can make that ancient longing for remediation and reparation and reconciliation a more integral part of who we are and who we may soon become. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm so looking forward to your questions.
Rochelle, that was absolutely wonderful and so moving and so thought-provoking. And I have to share something quickly, a really amazing kind of moment of serendipity that happened during your talk. I'm very lucky. My office overlooks Otsego Lake. I have a window right here. So as you were speaking, I was kind of glancing over, and just as you were quoting Susan Fenimore Cooper, talking about the landscape here at Seagull Lake and how the hillsides are kind of in balance with the lake and everything else. There was a break in the clouds, and I'm going to try to share this. Hopefully, oh, actually, let me turn off my virtual background. Unfortunately, you'll see my messy office in just a moment, but you'll have to bear with me. Uh, there was a break in the clouds, and this is what I was viewing as you were quoting Susan Fenimore Cooper. And I mean, it's just such a great representation of the sublime landscape that so many of these people were inspired by. But we're not done, because then later on, when you went back to View on the Schoharie and started to talk about the passing or the coming storm, we got this, which is probably harder to see, but there is the rainbow, which popped up on the other side of the lake. And my eyes popped out of my head when I saw that. And it was just such a wonderful thing for us. So thank you once again. And one thing that you did mention reminded me of something important I should have said at the very beginning, and that was for me to also recognize the land that Fenimore Art Museum rests on as the ancestral homeland of the Haudenosaunee people. So I want to make sure that I do that. At this time, if anybody does have questions, please start typing them into the chat. Christine asks, you referred to the dates of the American Renaissance as 1836 to 1855, and she wants to know why those dates specifically.
Yeah, well, they're arguable dates, right? Whenever we date an artistic period, we're picking things because we need to. But 1836 is important because Emerson published his essay Nature in 1836. Cole produced the entire Course of Empire series in 1836, as well as the Oxbow. So that's why we choose 36. We can end at 1855, which is when the Scarlet Letter was published. It's a year after Walden was published, Moby Dick is published. Some people push the American Renaissance period up a little later through Walt Whitman, 1855. Some people want to push it a little bit later up to about 1860 to take us through the different editions of Walt Whitman. But the whole notion of the American Renaissance is really well spelled out in the scholarship. You can read some great books about it, but it's also questioned because the American Renaissance, which was originally defined by H.O. Matheson, centered totally on white men. And now we're saying, well, wait a minute, there were a lot of other people who were producing artistic things at that time. And so there's another wonderful book called Beneath the American Renaissance. And, you know, people are tearing apart the American Renaissance, pushing the edges of the years and of its traditional central figures. So.
And
great
you accidentally
question.
answered the next question that somebody just popped in about, are there any authors or books that they can read to learn more about the American Renaissance? So you mentioned one. Can you say the name of that book again? And if there's any others that you can?
Yeah, well, I recommend Beneath the American Renaissance because it starts the work of deconstructing the first book, which is called The American Renaissance. I mean, that's the tome by H.O. Matheson defined it. But then later, Beneath the American Renaissance, I recommend that more firmly.
Okay.
Jane Tompkins also wrote a marvelous book whose title is escaping me. Oh my goodness! But Jane, I can email me and I'll send it to you. But Jane Tompkins also did some work to kind of dismantle that and turn attention to women.
And speaking of books, I would like to give you the chance, if you'd like, to talk about the unabridged version of Rural Hours, which you helped to release, which we have here in the shop. But can you talk about Rural Hours just in general, about how it's been published recently and what's different about what you've helped to do to bring out the full version again?
Yes, thanks for that. So Susan Fenimore Cooper published her most famous book, her most remembered book, Rural Hours, in 1850. And then that book went through 9 editions in the 19th century, which is saying something. That's a lot of press. And by the end of the 19th century, by 1887, there was a bit of a financial crisis in the publishing world. And Houghton Mifflin, the publisher, told her that they wanted to come out with her book again, but they couldn't quite afford to come out with the whole thing. And so under some duress, she cut 40% of the manuscript, and they issued that shortened version. And in the 20th century, it was that abridged version that appeared and is still available. So my co-editor and I in 1998 produced the full edition again. So the one that had seen life through most of the 19th century and the one that she intended for people to read. 40% of a text is a lot of text. So it's a very different book to read the full edition, and it's available through the University of Georgia Press. Interestingly, a lot of her commentary about ecological change is excised from the abridged edition. So for me as a reader, it's really important to be reading the full text.
Yeah. Did she decide what was going to be excised? Is there any record of like how she made those decisions?
Yeah, well, interestingly, so she was advised to take out things that weren't of sort of universal interest. So a lot of what goes is the local, right? Which is what we people interested in environmental history care about. So, yeah. Let's see.
Okay. Oh, new question. Can you share how you came upon the topic of ecological change and how you first learned about Susan Fenimore Cooper?
Yeah, I first learned about Susan Fenimore Cooper as a graduate student. And in the book that I'm writing, I tell a lot of the stories of my early encounters with her. But I took a course on American transcendentalism. So we were reading Emerson and Thoreau and Hawthorne, and we worked our way up to Dickinson. But along the way, I happened to come across a chapter by a woman called Vera Norwood in a book about American women naturalists. And it was just a chapter on Susan Fenimore Cooper, but totally groundbreaking. And I had never heard of her before, read that chapter, and then promptly went to my professor and asked if I could do my final project on Susan Fenimore Cooper in relation to the American transcendentalists. So that's how I found my way to her. I became really interested in her landscape aesthetics when I read deeply in her and realized how ecologically prescient she was, how she really seemed to understand environmental change well before even some of the leading scientists did. And the talk that I gave for the Fenimore last spring, which I believe is available in a recording, that tells a lot more about her environmental vision. So that's, Kevin, I don't know if you want to point to that recording, but I'm happy to share that. It's also linked to my website, if that's RochelleLJohnson.com.
Yeah, would love to send people to your website, so we'll stick with that.
Okay.
And kind of related to that, in the topic of transcendentalism, a question came in that as the president of the Thoreau Society, how do you relate Thoreau to Susan Fenimore Cooper? How do they compare? Were they aware of each other? Kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. They were not much aware of each other. So Henry David Thoreau did not achieve much literary fame beyond the local in his lifetime. And we have no evidence that Susan Fenimore Cooper knew of Henry David Thoreau. We have a very small amount of evidence that Henry David Thoreau did know of Susan Fenimore Cooper. He refers in his journal to her book, Rural Hours. He mentions a little passage from it. What we don't know is whether he learned of that little passage through reading Rural Hours or through a newspaper article that appeared that excerpted that little bit. So all kind of vague, but I have really enjoyed studying Susan Fenimore Cooper and Henry David Thoreau hand in hand, which is what I've done my whole career, because they show me two people in two slightly different areas of the country at the same time doing remarkably similar work, wanting to write about a local landscape over a period of time, watching its changes, commenting directly on them. To me, they're a wonderful, brother-sister pair who never knew one another. And I've written several things about both of them that I would love to share. So again, shoot me an email or reach out, and I'd be happy to do that.
And as I make a last call for questions from anybody, and as I said, that one popped up. So here we go. How did Susan Fenimore Cooper's education develop? Where did she learn, and how did she learn about her environment?
Oh, that's such a great story. And it's a really rich story. So Susan Fenimore Cooper grew up in a family who valued the physical world. particularly the women in her life, but also her maternal grandfather. So she writes about being in the carriage with her maternal grandfather, John Delancey, and having him point out to her the kinds of trees and plants that they were going by in the cart. She says, thus began my botanical education. And she was really little at this time. So she remembers as a very young child what plants she was seeing. Her mother was a huge influence on her very early years and was her primary teacher, her preschool teacher, we might say, and her first and second grade teacher. And then the family moved to New York. Susan Cooper went to school in New York for some time, but then was really well educated in Europe. By the time she went to Europe, she was dabbling in a few languages, but while she was in Europe, she learned them and studied very thoroughly a pretty traditional education. So James Fenimore Cooper and Susan Delancey Cooper, her mother, were generous in how they educated their daughters. Not totally typical for that time, but they gave her as good an education as they possibly could. And then once they were back in Cooperstown, when she was in her early 20s, she continued to be a really wide and deep reader. No college or university education for her at that time.
Wow. And I think this is a wonderful question to close things on. What is one question, or actually another one came in, so maybe we'll do two, but we'll start with this one. What is one question you would ask Susan Fenimore Cooper if you were given the opportunity? Going back in time, what would you ask her?
It's funny. I think I would ask her something personal. I've spent a lot of time with Susan Fenimore Cooper. You're not the only one getting her rainbows, Kevin. So I think I would ask her something personal because I know a fair amount about how she spent time in her incredible charitable projects. And sometimes I wonder, can I admit this, if she was lonely? Sometimes I wonder if she was lonely. She never married. She lived with her sister her whole life. And then when her sister died, when they were quite elderly, she lived with a niece. So she wasn't ever really alone, but I wonder if she was lonely. She was so professional and so accomplished. She founded this orphanage and helped found a hospital and had a sewing school for girls. And she didn't just found the orphanage and then sort of leave it to others to run. She was there all the time, did Sunday school lessons for the kids every week, and just gave so much of herself. And I wonder what sustained her. I think it was the giving, but I just wonder sometimes if she was lonely.
Wow. Can you share the source for the Thomas Cole quotation? I'm thinking that's from the speech that he gave. That's my guess.
Yes. So the passages of Cole I shared are all from his essay on American scenery. You can even Google that essay. Essay on American Scenery by Thomas Cole, 1836.
Yep. I found
and
it
those
pretty
passages
easily.
are from the end. Sorry.
Yeah, I found it pretty easily myself. It's beautifully written. It's really, you can sense, not just from his paintings, but from his writings, his love of the landscape. Yeah. Highly recommended. Let's see here. I attended one of your early lectures about Susan Fenimore Cooper where you shared that her work had some blind spots when it came to the topic of race. Can you give some examples of those blind spots?
Oh, yes. I mentioned very briefly that she adheres to a vocabulary that we would see as really problematic. But she also adheres at times, especially earlier in her career, to the inevitability of Native American removal. Early in her career, she doesn't question that a lot, but she did more writing that isn't as well known, none of it published, later in her life, where she gets more remorseful about Native American dispossession from her region. And so she has blind spots in the sense that it's not as if she was writing a treatise, against Native American removal, but she became increasingly sensitive to that issue. So yeah, I think that's what I'll say here, but I'm really looking forward to November and to diving into some of these sources for that November lecture that Kevin mentioned, and really dwelling on this. Because I certainly don't want to excuse her troubling behavior, and I don't want to silence her concern. I think it's important for us to know that even people who were participating to some degree in a problematic ideology, they had misgivings, they had concerns, and it's really important for us to know that. It sounds obvious, but that's not part of the story that we tell, and we need to be telling that story.
Mm-hmm. Rochelle, thank you so very much. It's always such an honor to hear you speak and to be able to, you know, present you here at Fenimore Art Museum, whether virtually or in person. And I always learn so much, and it's wonderful to give Susan Fenimore Cooper more of a voice here in Cooperstown, even where she's not nearly as well known as she should be. So I can't thank you enough.
Thanks to all of you for coming, and thank you so much, Kevin, for having me. It's just such an honor and delight to be here.
And we'll